Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, GBENGA ABOROWA. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the security issues happening on the continent. But before we delve into today's security matters, let's bring you the latest security headlines. United Nations demands release of 4 MINUSCA soldiers in the Central African Republic. Ex-Guinea-Bissau Prime Minister barred from leaving the country over alleged involvement in coup. Former Uganda's child soldier Alex Twinomugisha, accused of murder, released after spending 22 years on remand without trial. And at least 82 protesters have been killed since the October coup in Sudan. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Today on Secure the Continent, we will be looking at the role of private military and security companies in Africa. These corporations have become increasingly visible with their role in civil wars in some African countries. We have more details for you in this package.
The use of mercenaries is as old as warfare. Nations and empires have historically used mercenaries to safeguard thrones, lives, properties, and control. The mercenaries of old have become modern private military and security companies, or PMSES, guarding nations, assets, and now are contracted to prevent or stop insurgencies. PMSES have a controversial history here in Africa. In the 1990s, a PMSE known as Executive Outcomes helped Angola win a war against rebels. Next stop was Sierra Leone at the height of the war for control of the diamond mines. Recently, African countries have also called on the Russian PMSE Wagner for support. Present in Libya and the Central African Republic and now ready to enter Mali, the Kremlin-backed company is the new mercenary choice, but there are critics and criticisms. PMSES are rarely held accountable for their human rights violations. These soldiers for hire may sometimes not be on the same page as the military of the country they are operating in. The UN Working Group says the presence of PMSES undermines the multilateral nature of ties, and in the past, the UN has set up a convention against their presence. This is yet to be supported by any permanent member of the UN Security Council. PMSES are accused of working without rules, but have been seen to get the job done, as DIC Advisory Group did in Mozambique. Where militaries fail, they seem to succeed, but at what cost? Are mercenaries here to stay?
Now, joining me to discuss this evening, I have OVIGWE EGUEGU joining in live from Abuja, Nigeria. He's a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, and Dr. NATHANIEL POWELL, a West Southern Africa Analyst at Oxford Analytica and research associate at the Center for War and Diplomacy, Lancaster University. He joins live from Aberystwyth in Wales. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you and welcome to Secure the Continent.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I would like to start with you, OVIGWE. What are private military contractors and what's the genesis of these organizations in Africa?
Well, just like the opening segment mentioned, the history of private military corporations or companies really goes back to even civil war era, and the fact that we've had armies that have not been up to task in many ways and in several countries necessitated the use of these very skilled, very well experienced, and I would say result-oriented entities we call private military organizations. Now, the main issue has always been that they are for profit, But one of the upsides is that if you do really are able to provide that profit, they can, to a large extent, really help you turn the tides, of the world. So whether it's executive outcomes decades ago or even work that we're seeing today, but that doesn't mean that they are supposed to be seen as a real solution to a problem. The best way you can describe private military organization, and if a government is actually employing their services, it's meant to be for a short-term basis, just to change the reality on the ground, and then their own armies would then go on to do the more long-term work, which is why you have a regular army in the first place. So going forward, I think the reasons that necessitated their employment in the past are still very much present today, because to a large extent, many African armies still lack a lot of capacity to meet the challenges that they currently face.
Thank you, OVIGWE. I'd like to take Dr. Powell on this. There is a scholarly debate on whether private military security companies are mercenaries in new clothing. My question is, why have they become so attractive to national governments, even though these countries have national armies and special forces? Why the growing interest in Africa, and how well do these private military contractors perform?
So thanks for having me on. So I just go back to OVIGWE's original point, which is that this isn't really something new. And in fact, I'd go back even before the Nigerian Civil War. This goes back to the colonial era with European company states hiring mercenaries to kind of do their dirty work, either local mercenaries or bringing in outsiders. The entire Belgian colonization effort in Congo was effectively done by mercenaries from many European countries. And the reasons for that are actually very similar to some of the reasons that a lot of African countries are resorting to mercenaries today, and that's because the capacities of the security apparatus of different African states who are confronted with substantial armed insurgencies is not always up to the task of actually combating those insurgencies. So there's a need to find off the shelf, if you will, expertise to deal with those needs. And as OVIGWE said, the idea is it's on a short-term basis. Unfortunately, is not always the case. In the 1960s, for instance, mercenaries were widely used in civil wars in Congo and in Nigeria, and they were there for the duration. And they were not always as effective as their host countries or host secessionist states in those cases were hoping that they would be. And I think that's the case today as well. We look at executive outcomes and their success in Sierra Leone, and that I think may have been kind of a trigger or a reference point. It's still a reference point today for lots of countries that go to look to mercenaries, and to some extent maybe some of Wagner's successes in CAR in Central African Republic. But I think those are the exceptions rather than the rule. Mercenaries tend not to be nearly as successful as they either claim to be or as governments hope they'll be. Either in the operational level or in terms of their political impact and the insurgencies they're aiming to combat.
So, Dr. Powell, I believe there's still a debate on how successful are these mercenary groups. Now, OVIGWE, Dr. Powell did assert to what you said about the reason why national governments look for the service of mercenary groups is because of failure and limited capacity of their militaries. The question now is the role of private military contractors in African security should sometimes is seen as a function of limited statehood in Africa, the concept of limited statehood, because most states are neither consolidated nor failed. The role of private military contractors tends to fill the vacuum in the ability of some African states to provide security for its citizens. Do you agree with this assertion? And is this always the case? Because I remember a few years ago, Nigeria did hire some private military contractors to help in the fight against Boko Haram. And you wouldn't say Nigeria is a failed state or was a failed state in that sense.
Well, the fact of the matter is the need is there because these states have incapacity, right? But where I would disagree, I actually agree with what you said there. But where I would disagree is that the use of mercenaries is something that is only seen in weak states, right? So we wouldn't call these states like Nigeria and other African countries failed states in the sense, but of course they are weak states, and weak states need capabilities, and but competence and weapons equals capabilities, right? So when you have the militaries in the shape that they currently are in, whether in Nigeria or even Central African Republic and other countries, Mozambique and the likes, then you know that it is for you to get the military where you want them to be will take a lot of resources, finances, partnerships for training, capacity building. But you don't have that much time because the insurgents are not going, and they're not going to sit around waiting for you to build your military and then step into to fight. So in Nigeria's case, it's actually very, very, very clear. And also you have to see that sometimes the governments do this for political reasons, because if you look at the Nigerian case, for instance, they're approaching elections, the Jonathan government knew that the issue of Boko Haram was on the ballot. If anything, it was the number one issue on the ballot. As at the time, 2013, it was really, really bad. We had even had chief of staffs being changed and change our strategy, in the Northeast theater. But of course, he knew he didn't have time. He needed a quick and effective solution that at least would change the dynamics on the ground in the lead up to the elections, right? So those results become a sort of win for, or at least they don't hurt his chances in the polls.
Even though it's temporary.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, with a more long-term plan, because some of the weapons we even received during the first year of Buhari's administration, those weapons are really negotiated for during Jonathan. So it's not as if states actually focus on the short-termism. They do focus on long-term. Now, a second part of where I would disagree is that it's only for weak states. No, in Afghanistan, for instance, and in Iraq, the United States use mercenaries profusely. So we had the likes of Blackwater Academy. They represented a huge chunk of U.S. fighting power in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly towards the end of those military campaigns. So it is when the politics and when the financial conditions allow, and you really want to sort of minimize military casualties to avoid political consequences, then you always see that mercenaries are used, particularly in very so-called powerful states.
Thank you, OVIGWE. Now, Dr. Powell, one recent investigation argued that contracting private military and security companies during wartime can actually increase military effectiveness, just like the example of Blackwater that OVIGWE just gave us in Iraq and Afghanistan. And with it, the intensity of the conflict, others are of the opinion that have explored their impact on the duration of the conflict. It makes it drag on. What side of the divide are you on, and what are your thoughts on this, Dr. Powell?
Well, so I just want to go back to something that OVIGWE pointed out, which is very true. It's not just weak states that contract mercenaries. Yes. What's interesting about the American case, and I think this is actually similar to the Nigerian case in the sense that the United States employed mercenaries, or private military contractors is the euphemism, in order to basically fill gaps that they had. So the United States wanted to have, they couldn't actually have hundreds of thousands of troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, but they could have tens of thousands of contractors in addition to the forces that they had deployed. And partly this was for political reasons, right? The deaths of contractors obviously aren't nearly as politically weighty as the deaths of actual government soldiers, but also they're perceived to be, but they often aren't, cheaper than your own investing your own budgetary resources into building your own forces. So going to the question of their effectiveness, and you have the same problem in Iraq and Afghanistan that you have in Nigeria, or let's say perhaps not Nigeria, but perhaps in Central African Republic and Mozambique, where you have mercenaries who aren't that accountable and maybe are at some point, effective at specific missions, but because of the lack of accountability and because of their human rights abuses, they tend to have a negative impact on the political dynamics that are required to actually defeat these insurgencies. Iraq is a prime example. Blackwater was responsible for terrible human rights abuses, not just in terms of detention facilities and abuses of prisoners, but also massacres and murders of civilians. And Wagner is doing the same thing in Central African Republic. And we don't know yet about Mali. I don't think there have been any reports yet of these kinds of things occurring yet in Mali. But if it were to occur, if Wagner was to be responsible for substantial numbers of civilian deaths, this actually worsens the problem because ultimately insurgencies are a political threat to the state rather than necessarily a military threat to the state. And that those political issues are not things that mercenaries can address. And so at their best, mercenaries can, apply, a very specific kind of Band-Aid to a very specific kind of wound. But there is always the risk that they can worsen the situation through their impact on the political dynamics of conflict, as they did in Iraq, as they did in Central African Republic, and as they may do in Mali.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. You exactly cannot shoot your way out of political problems. You still have to negotiate and find a means to deal with that. Now, OVIGWE, there's deep international, talking about Wagner, there's deep international concern over Mali's discussion and partnership with the controversial Russian private military company, the Wagner Group. The French and European militaries just recently announced the withdrawal from Mali. Russia's gradual advance in Africa is making policy makers in the West nervous. Why is this the case?
Okay, so Mali is a very interesting example. And before I even go on, I really want to applaud and agree with the points my colleague on the panel here made, because it is very, very true in the sense of the risks that ensue when you really employ the services of private contractors, because mind you, these people are fighting for profit. The more effective they are on the battlefield, the more their reputation as an effective group, really, sort of shoots up, and
their cooperation
pushes them to a lot of, in many ways, they go on to do some very shady things to achieve those results. But on the flip side as well, there's also the fact that they benefit more if they prolong the conflict. So you have to get a very good balance. And I think that is exactly one of the issues with Mali. So the outrage coming from Europe, you have to understand it from it's more of a political, I would say political situation as opposed response as opposed to a military or security related response. In the sense that there is a fierce geopolitical competition. In fact, it's even playing out right now between Russia and Europe. And within that context, in Africa, in that context, there are flashpoints. So Libya, for instance, is a flashpoint where Wagner is very active and has been very effective to a large extent, supporting Haftar. And on the opposite side, have European countries and aligned with Turkey. And so Wagner has been a problem for them on the ground for them to create Libya into the states they want it to be. Now, if you go to Central African Republic, that's supposed to be seen as one of France's vassal states on the continent. And then you have the government of Touadéra essentially being protected by Wagner, and that move shift from being under France's guardianship offends France to a large extent. Mali, it's even more the case because with the whole of West Africa and the Sahel, whether it's Takuba or Operation Barkhane or G5 Sahel Force, these operations are either French-backed, French-led, or French-sponsored. And with Mali showing signs of moving away again from that, French stewardship, and replacing, French military presence with, a Russian state-affiliated organization like Wagner, of course, that is very upsetting for France, because it's seen as one, you are bringing in the services of a geopolitical rival. That's one. And then secondly, how dare you really, want to dictate the terms of how the security cooperation is going to be, because that is, they like to really call the shots, in this domain. So I would say we cannot understand that outrage from a perspective of, military junta is anti-democratic, it's authoritarian, it's illegitimate, as the French foreign minister was saying. No. It's more the fact that Wagner is slowly, acting as a long arm of Russia in the continent, reshaping things and finding places or where there's genuine discontent for France, and Mali is one of the latest, examples of that.
So the presence there erodes French geopolitical influence in areas that have traditionally been their bastions, Central African Republic and Mali. Coming to you, Dr. Powell, still staying on the issue of Wagner and the French. France's Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, accused the Russian private military contractor Wagner of plundering Mali's resources. And he also, 8 years after the arrival of the French, the security crisis has spread to Burkina Faso and Niger, with numerous different groups, some linked to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State group, roaming the region from their bases in the Sahara Desert. The British Foreign Office described Wagner as a driver of conflict and says it capitalizes on instability for its own interest, as we have seen in other countries affected by conflicts such as Libya and the Central African Republic. My question to you, Dr. Powell, is this: does the Malian government not have the agency to evaluate the situation and choose who they want to do business with as a sovereign state? And why this concerns? Don't they think Mali should know what is good for its people, even though the government there is democratically elected?
Right. Well, I think as the situation demonstrated very clearly, the Malian authorities do have their own agency and did contract either with Wagner or with other Russian contractors against the wishes of their French patrons and international patrons, and that was a sovereign decision. I think part of the reasons for that in the Malian side were domestic political. One was to put pressure on the French, and the other was domestically to try to shore up the junta's legitimacy. And I think so Western concerns are overwhelmingly geopolitical, obviously related to the competition with Russia and their concerns with Russia. There is a more, let's say, less geopolitical concern in maybe not strategic circles, but at least in maybe more kind of expert circles, if you want to put it that way, that recourse to Wagner specifically, but also other mercenary groups, adds essentially replaces Barkhane with all of its problems, and there are lots of problems with Barkhane, with a smaller force, with a smaller logistical footprint, with less capabilities, and a higher propensity to commit human rights abuses, and potentially not as capable as French forces to address the problem the French themselves have not been capable of effectively addressing. So, in other words, this is more of a political move that can't solve the security problem, likely won't have a positive impact on the security situation, but does so at the cost of sacrificing the French presence, which may have been itself destabilizing, but I think for somewhat different reasons. And the presence of Wagner is being kind of portrayed by some Malian authorities and officials as a solution. I mean, really, it's really built up as these guys are going to solve a problem the French haven't been able to solve. And I think it's clear to a lot of outside observers that Wagner is not going to solve that problem. And when it comes to the question of pillaging resources, the contracts that we do know about that Wagner signed with states like Mozambique or Central African Republic do suggest that they're kind of the quid pro quo of them deploying troops is not only cash payments. In Mali, the estimate's around $10 million a month, but also control over mining sites or other kind of extractive industries.
But the use of the word plunder,
yes.
it's for the Central African Republic government in Mali, they'll say, look, were doing business. Because if you use the word plunder for Wagner, the French companies also get mining concessions where they have influence. So you could as well use the same word for plunder if plunder means doing business.
So obviously, plunder is a very politically charged expression. You're absolutely right. That said, the French have been fairly careful to not get economic concessions in Mali. Actually, there are very few. There's very little French economic presence in Mali. There are no mining sites owned by French companies in Mali. They've gotten out of Mali decades ago, and probably that was for political reasons. Probably because they weren't profitable for French. The costs of French investments were not compensated by the profits they were getting from Malian gold mines in particular. So when accusations are pointed, the French are there for reasons that are not necessarily altruistic.
Okay.
But looting resources is not really one of them. They're there for other reasons. Whereas Wagner is there for two reasons. I think this is the general interpretation of a lot of outside observers and especially people in the West. Is they're there for two reasons. One is getting access to resources and profits, and then the other aspect is that they are the long arm of the Kremlin's foreign policy, Russian foreign policy. That being said, had Mali decided to go with a more expensive, say, South African option or a Western option,
yes,
there probably would have been much less say, protests in Western ranks than going for Wagner. Despite the fact that the outcome would probably be the same, they'd probably be just as violent towards civilian populations. They'd probably be just as ineffective in their longer-term ability to combat insurgency, and they would have the same negative political effects would be occurring.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. We'll go on a quick break. So much to still unpack. When we come back, we'll be looking at what exactly, how profitable or how successful will Wagner be in Mali, and also all the issues surrounding private military contractors in Africa. Do stay with us. We'll be right back. You're welcome back to Secure the Continent. If you're just joining us, we've been discussing the role of private military and security companies in Africa. I still have with us Mr. OVIGWE EGUEGU and Dr. Nathaniel Powell. Now, before we went on the break, we were discussing Wagner and its influence in Africa and its work in Africa. OVIGWE, people always criticize Wagner for its ties to the Kremlin, the Russian government. But when it comes to Blackwater secured contracts of over $1 billion in the war against terror. And in the same light, can't you say, I mean, these are contracts coming from the Department of Defense. Would it not be the same thing to say that, you know, they have ties to Washington and they've committed the same crime? Or is the modus operandi of private military contractors to have the burden of human rights abuses and everything that comes with it? Is that how all private military contractors operate?
Yeah, I mean, Eric Prince founded Blackwater, right? Eric Prince, the former U.S. Navy SEAL. So this is someone true and true from the U.S. military establishment, and went on to actually create black water that was used very well across the Middle East during the height of the War on Terror. Now, one of the main problems I have with what I would call not necessarily hypocrisy, but the criticisms of African countries contracting Wagner is they are trying to project their geopolitical concerns on African countries. We don't have a problem with Russia. Like we're not in strategic competition with Russia. So we have to work with what we believe it's in our best interest as states. And then cost effectiveness. For instance, do you think if the Malians looked at the landscape of the most competent private military contractors today and could afford academy, for instance, because Blackwater is now called academy, they probably will have done so if they know that is not going to cause any form of political,
upheaval,
like backfire politically, because of course you can contract academy and they can be the ones to actually coup you out of, since you are actually a military government that sees power via coup. So there are a series of calculations that must have gone into the agreement to actually get contract the services of Wagner, and that is something like my colleague Nathan here was saying about agency. Yes, of course, the Malian government exercised agency to get Wagner, knowing fully well that even the population of Mali does not want French forces in the country anymore. You just have to look at the streets of Bamako and the protests and the celebrations that follow that narrative, right? So when the French pulled out of Timbuktu a few weeks ago, about a month ago, we saw the celebration when the Malian government gave an ultimatum for the French ambassador 72 hours to vacate for his comments. Of course, we saw the support that came, supporters of the government on the street. So we can't just simplify the Wagner being in Mali as simply a government that is just acting on its own. It's acting in a way that really it believes it's in the interest of the Malian people, whether or not they were elected. And that is one of the issues. So issues of human rights and those concerns now is the responsibility of the government. So because if you had the initiative to get Wagner, then you as a government also have the responsibility to ensure that organization upholds and respects the rights of Malians in the discharge of their duties. So there's not an excuse for because you have a private military organization, there's not an excuse for them to go into the battlefield and just do whatever they like. So on the short term, you can use these private military organizations, but Mali has a lot of work to do. And like Nathaniel said, rather, you cannot solve the problem in Mali with Wagner. That is just wishful thinking. Okay,
thank you, OVIGWE. Just before I go to Nathaniel, why is there such a huge anti-French sentiment in Mali? Because I remember when the French, under former President Francois Hollande, sent French troops, when the jihadists were marching, they were almost at the doorstep of Bamako. They celebrated them and they saw them as liberators. What changed?
What changed is that nothing has changed, in the sense that in 2013, 2012, 2013, when it was sort of built up from the north of Mali, both jihadists and also separatist Tuareg rebels, of course, we knew that the most important thing at that point is to prevent state fracture and state failure. Anybody in the world that was ready to provide that service would have been welcomed by Malians. It is not that they preferred France as at the time, or maybe they would have preferred the Americans. It was just a very desperate moment. And the French came in and they delivered on that, prevented the states from fracturing. Now, where they have failed is to really change the security situation in Mali, having had the almost exclusive control over the cooperation and strategy and international strategy in Mali and in the Sahel for almost a decade now. when, for instance, when people talk about what is causing the resentment, you had the French coming in 2012, 2013 with Saval, and then there was Bacan. As at 2015, of course, we started seeing a lot of advances being made, but late 2014, rather 2015, started getting worse. In 2015, in Burkina Faso, for instance, they hadn't had any conflict, any issue with terrorism. But look at Burkina Faso today. Burkina Faso suffers almost as much loss of military troops and territory as maybe in Niger. So when you say why the resentment, forget the colonial baggage. The problem really comes down to effectiveness. In 9 years, the problem today is worse than it was in 2012. The only solution or the only success being that the Malian state did not collapse. Okay,
thank you, OVIGWE. Now, nothing has changed in 9 years of French deployment to Mali. I guess that's why the Malian government said, you know what, let's try new partners. But the French, with all the sophisticated weaponry, with air assets to deploy, couldn't succeed militarily in Mali. So, Dr. Powell, what is Wagner really going to do in Mali? What is Wagner's deployment going to do in the war against terrorism in that country? And I know you said earlier that you're not sure they can win militarily, but when you look at executive outcomes, for example, they were very successful in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. Don't you think, because I mean it's just the beginning, we haven't seen the future, would you give Wagner a chance? I think you need to unmute your mic. Yes. I can't hear you.
I was on mute.
Okay, great.
Classic mistake. I'm sorry. So to go back to kind of OVIGWE's point, which I think is relevant here. So first of all, I think that there's no choice but to hope they succeed. Again, very skeptical that they will. And that's for the same reasons the French have not been able to succeed, which has also led, one of the reasons that led to lots of anti-French sentiment. It's not the only reason. And that's that you have, the French succeeded in 2013 because they were attacking a series of jihadist groups that were trying to hold territory against an industrialized army, an army from an industrialized country. That wasn't going to work. They weren't going. I mean, they were going to be able to take those cities back fairly easily because France is an advanced military. But when it comes to fighting an insurgency, that's different, and that's what Sahel became Operation Barkhane. Operation Barkhane became a counterinsurgency or counterinsurgency light operation. They don't have the numbers to do it properly, but also they didn't have they're facing a political situation which is not amenable to military solution. You need to have a military aspect to that solution, but that alone can't do it. They're running the same problems the Americans had in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can have disproportionate military means and material, but that's not going to win your war. Yes. And I think there's a lot of regional frustration that the French were unable to contain the expansion of jihadist groups. And I think a lot of that fed that into kind of suspicions that, well, the French are so powerful, but they're not able to do this, therefore they must be supporting these jihadist groups. That's not the case. It's just that France is not capable of fighting a counterinsurgency because it's not equipped to, and it doesn't have political authority to do so. And its reading of the conflict was so simplistic in terms of seeing this as a war against terrorism rather than as a sociologically complex series of interlocking civil wars and insurgencies, that they were incapable of effectively addressing the problem. And France alone couldn't do it anyway. These are solutions that have to come from the countries themselves. So that, plus the French have been very active in trying to prevent negotiation efforts with jihadist groups, which although maybe the success of these efforts in actually resolving the conflicts politically might be overrated, there are necessary aspects to any kind of political solution to any of these conflicts. You need to have talks between the governments and at least the component parts of these jihadist groups as part of efforts to undo the political coalitions that undergird them. And the French have been a complete obstacle to any of this. And this, I think, also contributes to anti-French sentiment. Plus, there's support for governments that are not particularly popular, like Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, or the first Malian junta, or the inconsistency of their support for the coup in Chad, but not for the coup in Mali.
Yeah.
So all these things combine to rising into anti-French sentiment. I don't think Wagner is going to be any better than this. Wagner is a lot smaller than the French presence. They're not going to be able to, they don't have the logistical and technological capacity the French have. They're much smaller. I think at the tactical level they might be very successful, although in Mozambique they were not. In Mozambique, they suffered serious losses against jihadist groups. But even if they're successful at the tactical level, we're talking about an area that is massive in size. And right now, the estimates for the size of Wagner's presence are maybe 1,000 soldiers, perhaps. That's a drop in the bucket. So even the best case scenario where they are operating completely in line with Malian political objectives and are cooperating with Malian forces and have an effective training program and are able to have successes in the battlefield, that is not at all going to address the actual problem that Mali faces. And it's barely a Band-Aid. And I fear that if their behavior in Mali is the same as it was in the Central African Republic, it could make things worse.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. Now, OVIGWE, private military contractors also have a number of controversies that derive from their historical legacy in the global south. The main concern revolves around the corporatization of security services and accountability. Now, the underlying argument here is that private military contractors, market-driven service providers, like you did mention earlier, which may switch sides in a conflict across time. Is there any historical evidence to allude to this? Because, I mean, it's who pays the money most. For example, if the rebels in the Central African Republic come up with a lot of money and they decide to pay Wagner, will Wagner switch sides? So are these concerns legitimate with regards to the corporatization of security and market-driven providers that they are?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and to even go, to begin to unpack that, we have to understand that the main or one of the main reasons why lots of these governments who are somewhat rebellious against Western stewardship are contracting Wagner, it's not necessarily because of the national security problem that they face, but more specifically regime security. Because they know very well about the history of coups and then counter coups and assassinations that will happen from their own military. So you would find in Central African Republic, the presidential guards get retrained and really sieves through, Wagner, and even as far as the president being advised directly on national security by someone from the outfit. So Mali's case is not going to be very different because the Malian army is not the most professional in the region, not to talk of on the continent. So what you find is that regime security component is very, very important because the Assimi Goïta, the Colonel Assimi Goïta, the head of the military junta, was almost assassinated, last year while he was,
praying in the mosque.
So that is before Wagner came into the picture. Yeah. So that is a very important thing. But now, going back to the question of the corporatization, that is very, very true. We need our governments and our countries to have armies that are capable to deal with national problems, because that is the reasons why you have army. Mali has about 21,000 soldiers, which is not nearly enough for what it needs to do, but for budgetary constraint, of course, that is what it has to deal with. Now, when we now go into the issue of switching sides, that is where even the state affiliation of these mercenary groups, whether it's Wagner or Blackwater, even becomes an advantage, because they would not switch sides just for profit. They would always consult with, quote unquote, the capital from which they came, from whence they came. So it is, for instance, I can almost say for Wagner's case, you will not find Wagner, even executive outcomes of our academy fighting for jihadis, tomorrow, because one, it's not even a moral issue. It's not an alliance issue. It goes back to, really how these mercenary groups are an extension of state policy. So it's where the state is aligned with, or where the state is looking at. That is where you will always expect them, to fight. So in antecedent, in the past, of course, when you had conflicts between maybe two countries, or like a secessionist group and a major non-ideological conflict, but yes, once the foreign policy of a big power changes, of course, you can expect that the mercenaries on ground, will change sides. So, but insurgency is a very different kind of conflict, warfare, because of the ideological component, and that is why I think one of the main reasons you will not see such a thing happen. It didn't happen in Iraq. It's very unlikely it's going to happen with Wagner in Mali or Central African Republic.
Thank you, OVIGWE. Just before we begin to wrap things up, and Dr. Powell, does the use... Okay, I'll stay with you, OVIGWE. Does the use of private contractors risk undermining international law? And beyond the role of combat support, do these companies also have all the services that they offer?
Well, I know there's a lot of global policy discussion or policy discussion at the global level around the use of mercenaries. And just like, again, mentioned in the opening introduction to the program, none of the P5 members of the United Nations Security Council have actually adopted. Why? Because they are the greatest exporters of these mercenary groups. Wagner, Russia, Academy and Blackwater, the United States. You have some from even the United Kingdom, as well. So that's why I keep saying that you can't isolate or just simply say these PMCs are exclusively private organizations. No, because they are registered companies in their home countries. They and also they are operating in a very dicey and geopolitically sensitive business. So they just cannot operate outside of government foreign policy.
Okay.
In many cases, I would say even in most cases when it comes to the counterinsurgency. So at the global level, the policy and the global law around mercenaries, the efforts being taken would struggle to be adopted because of the main mercenary groups come from countries who are the most influential in the United Nations,
G7
and they are going to scrutinize any piece of legislation to ensure that it's in accordance to their own views on this issue.
Okay, thank you, OVIGWE. Just before we wrap up, we're fast running out of time. Dr. Powell, are soldiers of fortune, mercenaries, private military contractors, whatever people choose to call them, have they become an inevitable part of modern conflict? In less than a minute, please.
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. They're an inevitable part of modern conflict because they've been an inevitable part of conflict for centuries. Not just in Europe, not just in the Middle East or Africa, but it's a pretty universal phenomenon. When states either need extra soldiers off the shelf or when they don't have the capacities themselves to address security problems, then mercenaries are often an off-the-shelf solution that they can go to with potential consequences that may actually undermine their objectives, but can also provide effective short-term solutions as well.
Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen, and contributions on the program, OVIGWE EGUEGU and Dr. Nathaniel Powell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all we can take on today's program. Thank you very much for joining us and Secure the Continent. Our discussion has been around the role of private military companies in providing security on the continent of Africa. I'm GBENGA ABOROWA. Until next time on Secure the Continent. Bye-bye.